Okay, hi, my name is Megan, and I'm here to review Manny's claim of fact speech. His proposition was denying prisoners the right to vote is harmful. His secondary claims were that prison is meant to rehabilitate, not punish. Rehabilitate, not punish. Disenfranchisement is harmful towards rehabilitation, and disenfranchisement is harmful to democracy. So in Manny's first claim, he discussed the penitentiary system, which he quoted, shall comprise treatment of prisoners, the essential aim of which shall be the reformation and social rehabilitation. So even though this information under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is accurate, this piece of information is only a small fraction of the whole declaration. So justiceinprisons.org claims that the quote mentioned earlier only refers to different forms of torture and how prisoners must have equal protection under the law. And however, this system does make it very clear that prisoners still lose the right of freedom, which includes possession of firearms and the right to vote. So in the second claim, he mentions Dr. Dami, who has a PhD in psychology, and wrote that disenfranchisement increases social distance and impede his or her acceptance and respect to the social norms. However, the act of incarceration alone already makes them feel isolated. So it is not solely because of disenfranchisement. So even if prisoners were allowed to vote, it would have little to no effect in the prisoners' attitudes. So according to U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the article titled "The Psychological Impact of Incarceration" claims that the longer someone is incarcerated, the more significant the nature of the institutional transformation. When most people enter prison, they find that being forced to an often harsh and rigid institutional routine, deprived of privacy and extremely sparse material conditions, is stressful and unpleasant. In the course of being institutionalized, a transformation begins, and they become more accustomed to the restrictions that institutional life imposes. So therefore, prisoners already know that they will not be integrated into society for a while or even forever. However, adapting and having a certain mindset is the only way for them to feel better, not through disenfranchisement. He also mentions that they will perceive themselves as useful and law-abiding citizens and help them reintegrate into society after release. However, how could we trust someone that went against our country's laws? In an article called "Prisoner Disenfranchisement" by Michael Plaxton, a quote that he used in his article claims that allowing prisoners the right to vote undermines the rule of law and civic responsibility because such persons have demonstrated a grave disrespect for the community in their committing serious crimes. Such persons have attacked the stability and order within our community. It could also increase the chances of voter fraud, and we must protect the ballot box from people who may corrupt it. In his third and final claim, which is how disenfranchisement is harmful to democracy, he mentions Christopher Uggan and Jeff Manza, who are both professors in sociology, and who say that if all the prisoners would have voted in 2000, 70% of them would have voted Democratic, which would have increased the Democratic votes by 500,000. However, if prisoners were allowed to vote, it would have been very biased toward the Democratic side. So according to LA Times, Assemblyman Matthew Harper of Huntington Beach claims that there is a pattern nationwide where Democrats are working to try to get as many felons on the voting polls as possible. And they are more likely to support Democrats because the Democratic Party has generally backed reducing sentences and other punishment for crimes. The Washington Examiner also did a study in 2014 where they looked at various states in the U.S., and one being New York, and they claimed that 61.5% of convicts were Democrats and only 9% were Republicans. He also says that the outcome could change in a very large way, including the outcome for the president. However, the outcome would have made a huge impact. So according to Heavy.com, 140 million people voted in 2016, and SentencingProject.org claimed that 6.1 million people were not able to vote in 2016 due to felony disenfranchisement. And out of those 6.1 million felons, only 29.2% said that they would participate in voting, which would only be an increase of 1.8 million voters, which is a 1.27 increase of voters from the overall amount of eligible voters, with some being Democrat and some being Republican. For some elections, I do agree with my opponent that it could have impacted the outcome for presidency, such as the 2000 election with George W. Bush and Al Gore, where George W. Bush won by like about 500 votes. However, this rarely happens, and it would not make a huge impact on majority of the elections, such as the 2016 election where Clinton won popular vote, but Trump won the presidential election through winning the electoral votes, or the 2008 election where Obama beat McCain by over 7% of the popular vote. So in conclusion, Manny brought up very reasonable points. However, it was not enough to convince me that prisoners have the right to vote. Thank you very much.
All right, on the first point, I like the idea that you're talking about, what the function of the judicial system is, and that there is more to it than what is being presented by the advocate on this particular point. The notion that there are other issues at stake here, I thought was pretty reasonable. You have a piece of information here that also talks about that issue. And I thought that was okay. The notion that it's not really going to alter their attitude toward themselves or their situation, that I thought was the strongest argument that you had in the presentation, that there are other things that affect their position in the society and the way they feel about themselves, and getting the right to vote is not chief among those. The longer that they're in the judicial system, in the incarceration, the bigger problems that they have, and the idea that voting is going to fix that or replace that, I thought was pretty well responded to by your argument on that point. On the third point, there seems to be a lot of data here that is, I thought you did a good job coming up with some statistical information, also referring to the data that the advocate presented. I'm not quite sure. You do minimize the importance of the vote overall when you have that last set of statistics about, it would represent 1.2% of the votes being cast. It might have made a difference in one election. It probably wouldn't have made a difference in another election, and it certainly wouldn't have made a difference in the middle election that we're talking about. That's all pretty speculative. I did think that it was interesting that you acknowledged in this argument that there seems to be a deliberate attempt to increase the felon voting for political purposes. I think there could be an argument here that says that this motivation is a little bit problematic, and instead of looking at what the impact is on the social system, that it's really shortchanging the system. I like the quote that you had earlier that suggests the problem is that it gets to a value argument that suggests the right to vote is, undermined, or giving the right to vote to felons undermines the rule of law. I think that that's a good claim to be making, but it's kind of close to being a value argument there, and it needs to be developed a little bit more. And I'm not sure that fits with the issue that's being presented here. I thought you were very effective at presenting the arguments and labeling your claims for the most part. At the end, it sounds more like it's an assessment rather than an argument, and I think you want to avoid that. Okay, thank you.